Hi, I'm George Norrie, and welcome to our Coast to Coast AM YouTube channel. Have fun, tell your friends, and share us with everyone. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Coast to Coast AM's mobile app. And always remember to log on to our website at coasttocoastam.com for daily articles, the best paranormal information, and all you need to know about your favorite guests. And now you can become a Coast Insider directly through the Coast mobile app. We welcome our international listeners and even offer a free 2-week trial. So don't delay. Become an insider today.
Evening, everyone. You're in the right place at the right time. This is Coast to Coast AM, blasting out of the Mojave Desert like a Scirocco, blazing across the land, slamming into your radio like a supercharged nanoparticle of unobtainium. Greetings from the boldest, bawdiest, most outrageous city in the world, the planetary capital of sun, fun, sin, sex, and secrets, my not-so-humble hometown, Las Vegas, Nevada. My name is George Knapp, your occasional host, designated driver of the airwaves, and moderator of tonight's upcoming cacophonous cavalcade of conversation. The Associated Press put out a piece recently updating the condition of former President Jimmy Carter. As you might recall, 3 months ago, Carter entered hospice care, staying at his home. That usually means the end is near, but the 98-year-old is still hanging in there. He's had time to meet with friends and family, reminisce, laugh a little bit. Says he's eating his favorite peanut butter ice cream. The fact that he's still alive, despite the mammoth health challenges he's faced in recent years, probably shouldn't surprise us, I suppose. Carter's life since he left the White House has been exemplary in many ways. His Habitat for Humanity project has helped so many families across the country. Carter, it's been said, was not the best president we've had, but many think he might have been the best person to ever serve in that job. He lives humbly in the same house he's had for decades, has been married to the same woman for 70 years. I mention Carter because we're going to talk about him tonight, in particular about his interest in UFOs and other weird phenomena. Longtime UFO author and researcher Grant Cameron has written a new book about Carter and UFOs, and it's really good, a good piece of work, tying together a lot of loose ends that I'd forgotten, things that happened during his administration regarding UFOs. Just to set the table here, as a presidential candidate, Carter promised to open up everything the government has on UFOs if he were elected. Once in office, though, he didn't. So why not? That question has raised a lot of speculation over the decades, and it was a hot-button issue even back during his presidency. Was he briefed about the real deal and sort of freaked out? Was he threatened? Was he stonewalled? A little bit of all the above? Maybe. Grant's new book takes a deep dive into the story and also reviews the amazing UFO material that was made public during Carter's years. What do presidents know about UFOs? What are they told, if anything? Do the intel agencies and Pentagon hold back the truth even from their boss? Grant Cameron has probably dug into presidents and UFOs more than anyone on the planet. He became involved in ufology back in 1975 with a personal sighting of an object which became known as Charlie Red Star. Those sightings occurred in Manitoba. In the past few years, he's turned his research interest to the involvement and actions of the president on the UFO problem. He's made 20-plus trips to the National Archives to dig up information and documents. His latest book, or should I say books, plural, Jimmy Carter, Paranormal and UFO Tales, just out now. Grant, so glad to have you back on the program. It's been a while.
George, thank you. I appreciate it.
You, no joke, you've done more research into presidents and UFOs than I think anyone in the world. And it's a central question. What do they know? When did they learn it? Do presidents get a UFO briefing? You know, we've heard more in the last few years from presidents and ex-presidents than I remember ever hearing. I mean, Obama, Bush, Trump, Clinton, Mrs. Clinton, who ran for president, they're all interested in the subject. All of them asked questions, I guess, when they could. So we'll dive into the question of briefings in a bit, but let's start with you. When you started to focus on presidents and why?
Well, it goes back to my sightings in 1975 where the first one I saw, it was almost like they wanted to make sure that there was no question as to what I was looking at. So I never really went down the path of sightings. I knew exactly what I had seen. Second night, the thing flew right at me. But as it was flying away the second night, it came at me, and then it made sort of a turn, and it sort of flew off, and there was a bunch of people there, and a guy with a camera, and people yelling and screaming. It was like a pandemonium. And I remember as it was flying away, I thought, oh, that's the next could be extraterrestrial. I thought, like, wow, it's like being in the Bible here. I mean, it's like some miracle you just saw. And then I'm thinking, like, what's it doing? Like, why is it in Carmen, Manitoba? There's nothing there. And I'm thinking, so for years it sort of bothered me. And I got all the sightings together of this town. Half the people in the town, over half the people in the town had seen this thing. Nobody wanted to talk about it, but I eventually would track down people and they would tell me what they'd seen. So I put it together in a manuscript, and the local publisher who should have published it, because it was a big story, said, "Mr. Cameron, you may believe in this kind of stuff. Count me among the unbelievers." And I was shocked. I just couldn't believe that you know, they wouldn't run with this big story. I thought this was the biggest story in the world. It would, you know, make $1 million from this and all this stuff. And it went nowhere. And so it was that question, like, what are they doing in Carmen, Manitoba? And then it was like, okay, I'm just a small guy in Canada, and I saw this thing, and all I want to know is, what was that thing I saw? I know for a fact it was like just out of this world. But the thing was, somebody's got to know. So then I started this procedure. So there was a synchronicity event. My father was a pilot for the Canadian government, and somebody in his office wanted to talk to me, had a UFO sighting. He was a radar tech. And he said, you know, if you really want to know what's going on with UFOs, you should see what the Canadian government was doing back in the 1950s. And I said, really? He said, yeah, I worked for the program. And I go, you work for the program? Like, I'm in 1,500 miles away from the capital. And I go, you work for the program? He said, yeah. And he started telling me the story of Wilbert Brockhouse-Smith, who ran the Canadian government UFO program. And he said he was the most brilliant engineer I've ever met, but he's totally crazy. He was talking to aliens, and they were landing in the backyard. And I go, what are you talking about? And that's the pursuit started. So I went after the Canadian government. What did the Canadian government know? And there was a lot of very interesting stuff I picked, and I wrote a book on the Canadian government thing. But we ended up trying to figure out where the Canadians got the information, because there's the famous top-secret memo, which is one of the only top-secret memos ever written about UFOs, where Wilbert Smith says, I went to the Americans, and I wanted to see if there was some smoke. There was a fire. There was smoke. And I was told by American officials, number one, flying saucers exist. It's the most highly classified subject in the United States. There's a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush, and it's of tremendous significance to the Americans. And then this famous line that I've used in the last couple of years, we were also told by American officials that other things might be associated with the flying saucers, such as mental phenomena. So the pursuit was then I'd gotten mostly what Wilbur had. I'd recovered his files. I talked to his wife. She told me all these stories, and his son, and where the files were, and all that sort of stuff. And then I'm thinking, well, who told Wilbur this thing about the flying saucers exist? It's the most highly classified subject. And that turned out to be a guy by the name of Dr. Robert Sarbacher. And this is in the Canadian. There's some documents where the Canadians are talking in the Canadian Embassy in Washington. And this Robert Sarbacher comes into the Canadian Embassy and interviews Wilbert Smith, and he's the guy that gave most of that material. And so we went after him, and then he said, well, I really wasn't involved. I was busy. I was working on radar for the Russians, and in Canada to pick up Russian missiles and stuff like that. The guy you should talk to, he was a guy in Pennsylvania, and that turned out to be Dr. Eric Walker, who was former president of Penn State University, chairman of the board of the Institute for Defense Analysis, top military think tank. And I was with a bunch of researchers, and I was sort of instructing them, and they were giving them names and or his number and stuff. And people were trying to get this guy to talk, and he was basically talking. And he was basically talking in rhymes and riddles about, it's been 40 years, we haven't blown up the world, leave it alone, go do something else. And I was trying to find his files. So I went to Penn State, I looked at all his files, and there was nothing there. And he had died in, I think, 94. And I found out that his files when he was at the Pentagon, and he was the assistant to the head of weapon research for the Pentagon. And there was this 1-year period then he was there, and he had talked that he was going to give the stuff to the Truman Library. So I went to the Truman Library, not even thinking about presidents or anything. I just wanted to get Walker's files and hope that this material, because he basically said he was confronted. We understand from Dr. Sarbacher that you attended a set of briefings at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 1950, and he said, yeah, I was there, so what? And the guy that was interviewing me said, what do you mean, so what? It was the most important subject, and this is how this discussion started, that he confirmed that he had been at these briefings. So we thought that the briefing material might be in these records that he left with the Truman Library. So I went to the Truman Library, in Independence, Missouri. And I asked for them, and there was a couple of files on Walker, and there was really nothing important or whatever. And then I thought, hey, well, the president's the most important guy in the world. He's a powerful guy. He's got to know what's going on, and that's my question. Like, somebody's got to know what's going on here. So that's when I asked the Truman Library. I said, well, what do you got on UFOs? And they said, well, they talked about the overflight in 1952 where the shoot-down order was given. And there's a week between the first sightings and second sightings, and all these telegrams started to come into the White House, and they had all these telegrams. So I was looking through all these telegrams, and people were saying, "Please, Mr. President, don't shoot them down, leave them alone," all this sort of stuff. And then I said, "Well, what else you got?" And they go, "Well, that's it. That's all we got." I go, "That's all you got?" I mean, this is you figure it's the most important subject. Like, why would the president not have anything? So then I figured, well, the Eisenhower Library is just down the road. It's maybe 2 hours down the road in Kansas. So I'll go to the Eisenhower Library and I'll find out what they're doing. And they had 5 documents. And one was the famous top secret, or the CIA Robertson panel report, which had been done under Truman, but it appeared in it was right at the end of administration, so it ended up in the Eisenhower Library. So that's when I said to the archivist, because there you have to, everybody's got a suit on, and it's all very formal, and you got to do a review and be interviewed before you can research there. And I said, you got 5 documents, and one was a telegram from one of the contactees and stuff. And then I said, how many pages of documents you got? And he said, 28 million pages. Anyway, 28 million, you got 5 on UFO, and that's when I go, something's wrong here. Like, and then I was determined to go to all of the presidents and find out what the presidents had known. And basically, it would be a very, slow day, because I would take 4 days to go to the Eisenhower Library, and within about 2.5 hours, I was finished all the UFO documents. And then for the rest of the week, I'd be sitting there reading oral histories from different people and trying to find something to interest myself, because there was really no documents. And that's when sort of puzzled me, like, why are there no documents in the libraries? And I guess it all comes summed up by, there's an oral history interview that was done by General Landry, who was the air advisor to Truman. It was in the Truman Library. And he talks about the briefing, that when he came in 1948, he had been told by Truman, I want you to brief me on UFOs every three months. I want you to go to the CIA, get all the material, and brief me. So we figured there was about 15 or 16 briefings that was given to the president, but they were all done orally. So in 1948, they already knew, don't put it on paper. It was all done orally. And that's what I believe is if this subject is handled by the president, it's not handled on paper. And it's, I guess, what Bill Clinton would call, this is a story Whitley Strieber tells, that he said he talked to Rockefeller, Lawrence Rockefeller, who had gone to the Clintons, and he got the Clintons at his ranch in Wyoming, and Bill didn't come down for the briefing, and so just Hillary was there, and so then they're going for a walk, and that's when Bill Clinton says to Rockefeller, said, the UFO issue, it's the story of the Arkansas tar baby? And Rockefeller says, yeah. He said, this is the Arkansas tar baby. You don't touch it. He said, you touch it, you're going to get stuck to it. And this is a story about the Arkansas tar baby, where they catch Brer Rabbit. He sees this tar baby, and the tar baby doesn't talk back. It's sitting on the side of the road, set up by the fox, and he gets mad, and he punches the tar baby, and he gets stuck with his hand. And then he puts the other hand, and he gets stuck, and then his feet get stuck. And that's what Clinton says. This is a subject the president cannot touch. This is a tar baby story, and you don't touch it. So I think that's what it is. So when I went after the Carter material, I basically, my end conclusion was that he had made this promise to the National Enquirer. There was a scrum of reporters in 1976 when he was running, and he was asked by the National Enquirer, you saw a UFO, and would you release the UFO files? And that's when he made this famous claim that if I get in, I will release all the UFO files to the people, except for unless it has to do with military secrecy. And that was the big catch. So he made this promise, and then when he got in, he didn't say anything. He never used the word UFO. The same as Gerald Ford before he was running when he was running for president. He was saying, or when he was a congressman, he said, not only do I want this thing opened up, I want to get the military people, put them under oath, and force them to testify to tell us what's going on. And when he got to the White House, he never used the word UFO either. Like Jimmy Carter used it before and after president, but he never used the word when he was in there. And what I came to the conclusion was he made this promise, and he did a bunch of stuff, but it was all done without his fingerprints. So he had other people doing things for him. He had For example, Jody Powell. Jody Powell was the guy that forced the documents out of the FBI. He said the FBI was under big pressure, and then McAbee wrote the book. I think it was 1,500 pages released under Jimmy Carter, and he had the CIA. There was the story that CIA had 14,000 pages. There was an FOIA. It was big at the time, FOIAs. Jimmy Carter talked about open government and the Sunshine Law and all this kind of stuff, and getting openness. And there was this rumored story. There was a girl that was working on behalf of the White House, a lawyer at the CIA, and they were hiding the documents. And there was supposed to be 14,000, and then it turned out it was only 1,000. And she was crying because they were playing these games, and she got so frustrated with what was going on. So she was there.
Grant Cameron, as we know, Jimmy Carter is in hospice care. He's been in hospice care for 3 months. He's on his way out. There's no question about it. I got a feeling, though, you maybe have sent your book to the publisher in the assumption that he'd be probably deceased by now, right?
That was part of it. The other part was that I was actually diagnosed with the same thing Jimmy Carter was diagnosed with in 2015, and then he did this immunology thing. Now, whether it's come back again, which probably it is because there's no cure for it. So when I had that, then I stuck all my files in boxes to send to the archives. And then I thought, well, Jimmy Carter, we should put this on the record, because when it comes to Jimmy Carter, he has actually turned sort of skeptical on the whole issue. If you see the latest the interviews he's done, he sort of is very. He even talks about it may have been a military test that was being done down the road. He says, yes, I saw a UFO, but that doesn't mean it's extraterrestrial. And he actually says at one point he doesn't believe there's extraterrestrials visiting the Earth. Which indicates either he's lying, but what I think it comes down to, my impression, you asked about what do the presidents know. I think basically all the presidents know if they want to know. I was leaked the files from the Johnson administration, which is another book that I probably will document. So the Carter book, I'm just documenting his material before I send my files away. And the Johnson, I've got the actual report. I actually got what he was told, who worked on the report, all this kind of stuff. And Obama has talked about it. Bill Clinton's talked about it. And I think it comes down to what Jimmy Semivan says. There does not appear to be any there. It's this idea that, yes, UFOs exist. Nobody's denying UFOs exist. But beyond that, it's like the core story, the story about Valet and Putoff and Green meeting at a Denny's restaurant. What do we know for sure? Well, we know we're being visited by something. We know we have hardware and bodies and stuff, but we haven't really been able to back engineer this stuff. It's the idea that almost the story that the government is putting out. Yes, UFOs exist, but we really don't know anything beyond that. And that's what I think it comes down to. Jimmy Carter knew, yes, this is real, but in terms of answers, I mean, even today, you'll hear over and over again that we really, it gets more complex as we go along. I think you would agree that, 1989, when you got involved, it seemed very simple, a story, and the more you look at it, the more you look at the weird stuff that goes on at Skinwalker Ranch and all the kind of phenomena that people report, you start realizing, it's not quite as simple as I thought it was going to be. Oh. It just gets more and more complex as we go along. So the idea that I have is that the president does know, but there's really not much they can really tell him other than the fact that, yes, people are working on this, but I think people have overestimated how much we figured out on this subject.
Yeah, I'm sort of in the same place. In addition to, no matter how far up the food chain I've gone, and it's been pretty high, there aren't really a lot of solid answers on it. It's real. It's from somewhere else. It's not us. But exactly what its overall intentions are, why it's here, where it lives, or where it originates, we really don't seem to know. The other part that you and I have both arrived at the same sort of general conclusion or junction is that the UFO mystery overlaps with a lot of other weird stuff. As you said, it's not really simple, like visitors from other planets coming here to check us out now and then. It's way more complicated than that. And it involves a lot of other phenomena that are just too weird. And as we both know, the different groups don't want to talk to each other. UFO people hate Bigfoot people. Bigfoot people hate the ghost hunters, and they all hate each other, right?
Yeah, but I think some people know, like, for example, you get, Lukatsky and people like that who go to the ranch and realize this connection, that there's this stuff, how do you put bulls inside trailers? How do you have a woman, take the groceries out of the bag and then all the stuff gets back in the bag? And they're looking at that kind of stuff, and people say, well, they're not really interested. Well, come on. I think you'd be totally insane to think that military intelligence would be interested in how to put a bullet inside a trailer. It's the Slide 9 thing. Stuff is going through walls and stuff. But when you take a look at, I always go back to Jim Semivan, because Jim Semivan, I think, is as clean as a witness as you can get. And when you hear him say things like, and he's got the briefing. He admits he got the classified briefing. When you hear him say, not only do we not, I don't think we're able to connect the dots. I'm not even sure there's any dots to connect. When you hear that kind of stuff, you realize that may be what it's about, is we're trying to figure it out. We realize there's all these weird things that are connected, and it all may have to do with this consciousness thing that the Canadians were told already back in 1950. But in terms of the problem, that it's very deep-seated, and there's only a couple of people, and even they're struggling with it.
Yeah, so Jimmy Carter had a UFO experience. You take a deep dive into that, because there are, as you document, there are different reported dates when this thing happened. The debunkers came out and tried to dismiss it as the planet Venus, which, as you point out, was preposterous. There were some other attempts to debunk it, and even Carter now has backed off, maybe on purpose. But that is really the main source of why he became interested and why he was talking about it on the campaign trail, right?
Yeah, and there's the thing that came. I went to the Carter Library to get the documents, and I actually met a guy at the Carter Library who was the archivist, who they usually assign an archivist to you, and you make your requests for this and that and whatever. And he was actually very interested in UFOs, and the reason he was interested in UFOs is because he went to school with Chip Carter. And he's the first guy that brought up the thing about the sighting. There's something wrong with the sighting, he said, and people get this all confused. So he made the sighting report in 1973, and people said, he was governor when he had the sighting. No, he wasn't. He was governor when he put the sighting report in. But the sighting supposedly took place in Leary, Georgia, at a Lions Club in 1969. But then when I'm talking to the archivist, he said, that date's not right. He said it happened earlier than that. He said I was in college with Chip Carter, and Chip Carter told me that story, and we were out of college in 1969. So he's saying that the date is wrong, and so it comes down to the fact that he sees this object. It's very spectacular. There's, I think, about 10 witnesses with him, and one of them was actually tracked down. I think there was a documentary film crew in Georgia that actually did a documentary on this, had the second witness. And it was spectacular. It was large. It was, different colors and stuff like that came in, moved away. But all Jimmy ever admitted was that, yes, it was very spectacular, and it wasn't Venus, and it wasn't a plane or anything like that. He sort of discounted everything. But in terms of what it was, he always has maintained the same thing. He actually says, it's a UFO, but I don't really believe, and that's sort of like he's going to his sort of the left brain. He's trying to, be respectable, a president. It's like he likes to get the Nobel Prize for, Middle East peace, but when it comes to UFOs, like no president wants to get stuck with this, because it now, since 2017, now it's a different game. Everybody wants to talk about it. It's cool to talk about now, but before that, you know what it was like. I mean, it was like you put your career on the line by doing this, and if you're the respected president, you want to do that, go down that road. So Jimmy really didn't want to talk about it. In fact, he actually made the promise twice. He made it once in this scrum with the National Enquirer, and then he was on the campaign trail in '76 in Wisconsin, and he also made that claim in '76 that I've seen a UFO, and I can believe that UFOs exist, and I'm going to get all the material out. And this group actually went. He promised that he'd meet with the group once he got into the White House. As soon as he got to the White House, it was like shut the door, and I produced the correspondence with this group trying to get a meeting with the president, and then the president's busy, he hasn't got time to see you, and he basically shuts the door on the whole issue. So it was something, I think, that if he were to do it again, I don't think Jimmy Carter would have reported it. I think it haunted him his whole life. He's always become the UFO president. But I think he regrets having done it, because there's been many times, and even Fox tried to track him down because he didn't want to talk about it. Fox tracked him down at a book signing where he has his father and they have a wheelchair and they're slowing the line down. He's got all these books for Carter to sign, and then he's asking Carter about UFOs. And that's when Carter says the same thing. He says, "Yeah, there's possibilities, but there's many explanations." It's this idea like, I saw the UFO. UFOs are real, but we really don't know what's going on here. And there's actually a second UFO sighting that I talk about in the book, and that was one that Jimmy Carter didn't. I probably still to this day doesn't know about, and that was he's in Panama in 1979, just before he left office, and that was where there was this photographer from the Defense Mapping Agency that was there, and she had two photographs left on her, and she was a professional photographer for the agency. She had two photographs left on her 36-roll film, and so she took one, and then she took the last one, and there's this UFO by Army One. Carter's flying away on the helicopter to go to Air Force One, and there's this UFO, this huge, bizarre-looking UFO right by the helicopter, clear as day. This is a daytime photograph, and there's a bunch of witnesses who report the same thing very close. So that one, I remember I went to the archives and to question that story, and we found the photograph. It's an actual legitimate photograph, and it's a real deal. And so Jimmy Carter had a couple of these incidents, but it was something that he really didn't want to deal with.
You know, the rumor that floats around, and you address it in your book, is that Carter was sort of this simple country guy, a farmer, who was probably fooled by the UFO keepers of secrets. You have a different idea about it, though. He might have had information that was withheld from him here and there, and he's even talked about it. But you think he was pretty sharp cookie, and that there's definite indications that he pushed to find out, right?
Yeah, he was an A-type personality. That's what I discovered by going to the archives. Anybody who runs for president has got a massive ego and thick skin. There's no way you're a little flower that makes it to the White House. It's a tough road going up there. And Jimmy Carter, he was not very well liked by the Secret Service. There's all these stories about him on camera. He would carry his bags like he was carrying his own bags and stuff. And as soon as he was off camera, he dropped the bags, and the Secret Service would have to pick out the bags and continue on. And I remember talking to the public relations officer there at the time, and she had worked for him in the White House, and they were just petrified of the guy because he was very against drinking and smoking, and the secretaries would be across the street, in the back of the restaurant trying to, have a cigarette or a drink, and they were all afraid they're going to get fired. He was a real aggressive type guy. And the story I go through the story in there. I talk about the one with the very controversial story about he asks for the UFO files from George Bush Sr. And the way it works is like in the Ford administration, Bush is the CIA director, so he briefs the incoming president. So he wins, and he makes this briefing, and the story is told that he gets refused the files. And I see the story very differently, because what he says is curiosity is not sufficient need to know. And that's exactly what Dr. Eric Walker told us as well. He said, you're just curious. Tell me why we should change the rules and the regulations to satisfy your curiosity. You answer me that question. And that's what supposedly Bush had said to Jimmy Carter. Curiosity is not sufficient need to know. If you want to get those files, you have to go to the House Science and Technology Committee to get those files, which means to me very clearly he's not talking about Roswell files. Because if the president wants the Roswell files or whatever, Bill Clinton asked for the Roswell files, they will move mountains to get whatever the president wants. And if you don't, you're fired. It's insubordination. He's the head of the intelligence. He's the head of the armed services. He's the head of the government. He's the chief of staff. There's nobody that can tell the president no. He's just going to fire. And Carter would fire. He fired lots of people. So the thing was, when he said you've got to go to the House Science and Technology Committee, he's talking about the files for the people. I'd like the sighting reports for the people. That's what he wanted. And because the Roswell files aren't going to be in the House Science and Technology Committee. No. That's very low level, and that would be like sighting files, scientific files, and stuff like that. So Jimmy Carter had asked for those files, and when he gets in, he can ask for whatever he wants. But that's where I'm thinking the big secret may be that there's really nothing there. That yes, you can get reports that Johnson, for example, asked. Because he was under pressure from James McDonald, who was friends with the president, and he was under great pressure. And the conclusion to the report, and I've got the final conclusion to the report for Johnson, was yes, UFOs exist, and we haven't got a clue. Beyond that, they're real, they're hardware and stuff like that, but we really don't know what's going on. And then he said, okay, now go tell James McDonald to get off my you-know-what. He's really he's upsetting me. And that was the reply to the president. We've done his UFO study now, but there was very high-level people doing this study. It was, the head of Lockheed Skunk Works and people like that. So that's the whole deal. Like, and the thing I bring up in the book is that Jimmy was interested in this kind of stuff, but he said the most spectacular thing he had seen was the remote viewing thing. So he's not just into UFOs. He had seen this thing with the remote viewing where they find the Russian plane. And when you hear Jimmy Carter tell the story, he just absolutely messes the story up as if he's having a hard time lying. He says, "Oh, it's a small American plane, and we were trying to find this thing with the satellites, and it was in Africa, and we couldn't find it, so there was this medium." And the story was there was two remote viewers. One was out of Hal Puthoff's organization. One was out of Verona's remote viewers out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Right.
And they actually found this plane. These two remote viewers, these two women, separate women, actually located this plane. And the CIA didn't believe it was there. It's 60 miles away. And they still wouldn't believe it after the remote viewers said where this plane was. And they were going to their location, and they were walking along, and these people were coming out of the jungle with pieces of the plane. And it was exactly where the remote viewers said it was. And that's when Jimmy Carter said it was the most amazing thing.
Yeah, you make the point in the book that Jimmy Carter gets asked this UFO question all the time, and each time he's asked, he shifts over to this story about remote viewers, or what he called mediums, finding this missing plane, which is not really the same thing, but could be, I guess, related on one level. You paint a really cool picture in the book. We're going to have to go to a break here in about 2 minutes. About Jimmy Carter comes in. It's post-Watergate. It's post-Vietnam. It's after the CIA scandals had been revealed by the Church Committee. It's a dark kind of a period for the intelligence community, and he comes in and basically wants to kick everybody's butt and clean it up. There's a story that gets printed in the U.S. News and World Report, and I remember reporting this years ago, 1977, in the Washington Whispers column, which you reproduce in your book, where they hint that, hey, there's some big stuff coming on UFOs maybe by the end of the year. It never actually happened. And, that, I guess in the next segment, we'll dive into why it didn't happen. But if anybody would know about UFOs, it would be George Bush Sr., because he'd been head of the CIA. And as you report, he wanted to stay on. He gave that briefing to Carter. He wanted to keep the job and stay on. Carter got rid of him and replaced him, and says later that maybe he did him a favor because he never would have been president if he had stayed in that job. But, Grant, let's talk about George Bush Sr., who was head of the CIA as Carter came in. He gives a briefing to Carter, and he wanted to stay. Some have speculated that perhaps because Bush was replaced by Carter, that he took it out on him by helping to sort of stonewall requests on UFOs. As you document in this book, Carter did make inquiries behind the scenes. He wanted NASA to take over some of the UFO work, and NASA sort of said, no way. There are indications that CIA may have dragged its feet, that there were others in the intelligence community who felt that Carter was a temporary occupant of the White House, and he didn't have a need to know. And then there are stories that he did get a briefing, and he was so upset that he was crying about it. Can you tackle all of that? First about George Bush, and then about the story on him supposedly being so shaken he was crying?
Okay, yeah. So George Bush actually was caught on Charles Huffer used to chase the Bushes around with his tape recorder, and he actually got Bush at one point. He said, "Come on, you're a CIA guy, you know what's going on." And Bush said, "Yeah, I know some. Yeah, I know a lot." It's very bad tape, but that's what he says. So the thing was that he was the CIA director, but only for a year, and the story is told that he got sort of fired, but he never even got in there. He never served a day in the Carter administration. What Carter did was he brought in a friend of his, Stansfield Turner, who he'd known in the Navy days, because he didn't trust the CIA. As you mentioned, the Church Commission had been there, and there was MK Ultra, and they were destroying documents, and it was just like a total circus. And he had up to 800 CIA people fired. I mean, he just got rid of all these people. So he wasn't popular with CIA, and he wanted with NASA. He wanted to cut the budget, and that's what made them so upset. Was he wants to cut our budget, and then he wants us to do this Blue Book thing. He can start all over again. And they got the CIA memo that said, don't even think about doing a a UFO study. So it was this whole circus that he was in a sort of a bad spot, and but when you look at the Bush thing, there's actually Dan Quayle, who was his vice president, who's actually on camera talking about this, and he said, yeah, Bush and I, it's the same story. Bush and I spent a lot of time looking at UFOs, but we weren't able to come up with anything. And he looked pretty serious when he said this, and it's this idea that Bush had all this power, but then you have the thing you talked about, the briefing. And that was the part that I've always wondered about, and it goes back to the 1980s, and you were involved in this. This is this thing that these documents were leaking. In fact, that's how John Lear came walking through KLS TV and dragged you down the rabbit hole with the MJ-12 document. And there was this Aquarius document that was supposedly filmed by Bill Moore in a hotel room on the East Coast. He was flown across, and he was given 17 minutes to photograph this document. This was the Aquarius document, which was supposedly the notes, the memory of a guy that was in the Carter briefing. It was supposed to have taken place in June of 1977, and it was this big controversy, and I always thought, because in the 1980s, what I believe they were doing is they were taking real material, sticking it in phony documents, and getting it out. So you control the narrative. You get stuff out you want, but it's all made-up documents. So this Aquarius document was always seen as being this made-up document. And then what happened was I was at the National Security Archives. I heard in Washington, I heard that there was this report that was going to be done, or they were going to do a documentary, and in there's this document from a Secret Service guy. He's interviewed, and they're following this story, and he said he was inside the briefing, and he's the one that started this whole deal. And we've got his name. I put his business card in the book and stuff like that, who this guy was. And he's the guy that said the thing about Jimmy Carter was upset after, and the story was that Billy Graham was holding Carter's hand during the briefing, and all this kind of stuff. And the story starts, and it all, I remember Hal Puthoff. We asked Hal Puthoff, and he asked Scott Jones, one of the high-level guys at the time, and Scott says, no, I knew Carter, there was no briefing. And it was this thing like, there probably was no briefing, this document was just made up or whatever. But then what happened was in that document with the Secret Service guy, it says Jimmy Carter was shown a 15-minute color film. And when I saw that, I went, whoa, maybe he did get a briefing. Because if you know the story, Hal Puthoff and NIDS were big time into what was trying to get was the Holloman Air Force Base film. And this is a story that Jacques Vallée tells the story that Eric Davis had phoned up Bush Sr., looking to see whether the Holloman Air Force Base film was real, and he said to him, did you see the film? And Bush said, yeah, I saw it. I didn't see it as in my presidential briefing. I saw it as CIA director, and there was all these stories about this rumored landing at Holloman Air Force Base where the aliens get out and they put the saucer in a hangar and all this sort of stuff, and it was all caught on film, different films. And that this film is shown to the president during the briefing. So when I saw this Secret Service guy talking about this 15-minute color film, I'm going like, maybe there was a briefing. Maybe this is the Holloman Air Force Base film. And so when Eric Davis asked Bush about it, he said there was all these counter stories. It was a flame out of an A-12. It was camera lenses. It was a counterintelligence. It was a training film. All these things to say, no, it wasn't a UFO film about UFO landing and aliens getting out. It was just all this other stuff. And he said, is it this? Is it this? And Bush said, no. And Bush says to Eric Davis, this is the real deal. It was the real deal. And then I add in the book, because I was told this story years and years ago, if Jacques Vallée tells the story, let's tell the rest of the story. And that was he also talked to Gerald Ford and asked Gerald Ford, did you see the Holloman Air Force Base film in your briefing? And he said, yeah, I saw it. And Eric said, well, when was the briefing? And Ford says, I'm never telling you when the briefing is. Don't even go there. So when I saw this thing about the 15-minute color film about Jimmy Carter, I'm going, maybe there was a briefing. And it's still up in the air because this whole thing with the documents, there's nothing you could tell from these documents. They were just so much bad material in them, but they were floating around, and you were in the 80s. This is a big time in the 80s. It was all these documents. Now it's films and Nimitz and all this kind of stuff. In that day, it was all these documents that Bill Moore was being leaked these documents, the same as Tom DeLonge was being leaked material that they're putting for whatever reason. So that's the story about the briefing. Hell believed there was, and I actually went to Hell because I wanted to see, would they, if there was a briefing, would there be documents? I said to Hell, I said, did you brief the president on remote viewing? Because there's no remote viewing documents in the presidential libraries either. And he said, yes, I did, up till I think 1988 when he left the program. Vice president and president both were briefed on remote viewing. So it's up in the air. If there was briefings, it's very highly classified, or it's done orally. There's no record of it, and that's the story about the briefing. It's supposed to have taken place in June of 1977. There's some material that a lot of material indicates it didn't happen. Even the archivist said, "Come on, Jimmy Carter was. I mean, he was real religious, but he wasn't stupid. I mean, he was like he's going to start crying. I mean, he thought it was just total nonsense. This whole idea about Billy Graham being in the room and all this kind of stuff, and he had his doubts. So it was sort of up in the air, but it was that 15-minute color film because NIDS was big time into that film. They were trying to get that film, and they were trying to track it down. Hell put off to talk to me because I was friends with Bob Emenegger. What do you know? What did Bob tell you about the film? They were trying to track this thing down, and NIDS was actually going to bring in the Paul Shartle, who had gone on camera and said, yes, I saw the film and there was an alien on it and it landed and the whole bit. And NIDS was going to bring him in, and 2 weeks before they were going to bring him to Las Vegas, he dies in a rollover car accident, which starts all sorts of other rumors. But that was the thing that interested me, was this 15-minute color film that indicated maybe there was something that happened. There was this thing, but like everything else in the UFO thing, and whether it's here or in the president's, it's all up in the air. Like the more you look at it, the more confusing it gets, and you just end up with all these rumors.
Yeah, a lot of stuff happened during those Carter years. Despite him not living up to his promise to open up the files, he did make inquiries. He tried to make progress, and there were some changes made to FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, and suddenly out comes spilling thousands of pages of previously withheld UFO documents. If you had written to the FBI prior to these changes, they would have said, we don't have any of those. CIA, same thing. And then they were forced to release all this material, and it was incredible. It was an incredible time for the subject matter. And then, of course, at the same time, Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind comes out, gets the world talking about UFOs. And then at the UN, the Secretary General Outant, you made some dramatic statements about UFOs being only second to the Vietnam War as an issue facing the United Nations. And then this guy from Grenada, the Prime Minister of Grenada, has a meeting, I guess, with Carter, and he introduces a resolution at the UN to study UFOs. I mean, there was heck of a lot going on there. Can you sort of lightly touch on some of those big points that you cover in the book?
Yeah, that's the thing where Carter is the idea he didn't do anything, but half of all the UFO documents came out that we have now, and maybe John Greenwald's changed that, but at that point, half of all the UFO documents that we had came under Carter. That he had made this move to force this stuff out through FOIA, and he was like this pressure campaign with this lawyer at the CIA to make sure the documents, they weren't hiding documents and stuff like that. And Clinton tried the same trick. Is he couldn't get anything to move, so he had this in 1995. He brought out this executive order that said if it's over 20 years, you've got to declassify it unless you've got an extremely good reason. And they had like 100 million pages or billion pages or whatever it was that came out, but there was no UFO material. So they're trying to force this thing out through legislation. So Jimmy Carter did make this pressure campaign to get this material out. But that's it really he still goes down in history as the guy who he really didn't do anything. And there was all sorts of things. Like there was this story of Danny Sheehan tells about the two reports, the classified reports that he maintains were done by Marcia Smith from the Library of Congress, which doesn't make any sense because Library of Congress is not supposed to work for the president. But he maintains absolutely that he was shown the classified Blue Book files, and he saw this crashed flying saucer in a snowbank. And he draws. I've actually got the drawing of the little writing, the alien writing that he produced that he saw, and that was given. He was given access to that, and he said these were classified reports that went to Jimmy Carter, one on extraterrestrial intelligence and one on UFOs. And the one from extraterrestrial intelligence says it's believed that there are between 2 and 6 extraterrestrial races now visiting the Earth. And the UFO one had a bunch of diagrams of different types of UFO shapes and stuff like that, and he maintained that these had gone to Jimmy Carter. So there was all this stuff going on in the background. There was Weber talked about, a lawyer talked about SRI was going to do a study on ET, extraterrestrial intelligence. And
Stanford Research Institute, right?
Yeah.
For those in the audience. Yeah.
Yeah, so they were going to do this thing, and he said he was involved in this. And I actually helped put off about this. Is this Alfred Weber? Is this story he's telling? Is this true? And he said, well, yeah, the story's true, but it's not exactly the way he's telling it. It wasn't his version wasn't really accurate. And this is his idea that I think it was public relations or public affairs or something was doing. They're going to do an ET study through SRI, and that it was all ready to go. And then this guy comes from the Pentagon, and he said, if this study goes forward, SRI will lose all its contracts with the Pentagon. And that was game over. They just shut it down. And see, here are all these stories that you can see in the background. It wasn't Jimmy Carter didn't do anything openly, but it was all this stuff in the background, which indicated he was getting other people to do this stuff for him. And it got written up in history as he didn't do anything. But you see all this stuff that was going on in this day, even the stuff with his CIA director, because you figure, well, the CIA cut him out because he canned all these people to the CIA. But Tim Good tells a story that he was good friends with Stansfield Turner, and he talked about with Stansfield Turner, corresponded with him for years after he left there, and he said the only thing he would talk about UFOs, the only thing he wouldn't talk about was MJ-12. And that's a telling thing, that he wouldn't answer any questions on MJ-12, which indicated that maybe he did know about this, that Stansfield Turner knew about it, and it was a subject they just couldn't talk about.
I wanted to touch on the other books that you put out at the same time. I don't know if you've got a death wish or what, but you put out 3 books at the same time, right?
Well, yeah, I've always got 3 or 4. Like some people, authors do, I got 3 or 4 going at a time. And then when it comes time to put it out, I've actually got a couple that are ready to go again. And I don't really do the editing. I let people edit. I don't really. Once I write it, I never look at it again. So I do it. But those I think are important books. They tell a lot more. One is on apports, which I think you know a lot about with Skinwalker Ranch. All the weird stuff. Even Tom Winterton, the guy that's the caretaker, has actually talked about this thing. And he uses now, and this is not in the book, but on the apports, or things that are moving around or appearing and disappearing and stuff like that. Tom Winterton says in one recent interview, he said there were there was hundreds, if not thousands, of incidents where you put something down and you go back and the thing's on the other side of the room, and I didn't put the tool there. What's it doing on the other side of the room? And it was this weird component that you mentioned before, all this weird stuff that goes with it. And the apport stuff is I think very important because it has this aspect, and it has to it's involved with near-death experience people, it's involved with out-of-body experience people, with people with poltergeists, with UFO experiencers. It's this weird aspect which indicates that all this paranormal stuff all may be the same thing. It's all this sort of higher level consciousness, almost like what Semivan said. This seems to have something to do with consciousness at a higher level that's beyond our scientific understanding at the moment. And then the other thing I do is goes that sort of all these people came to me for whatever reason. It was a synchronicity thing. Is the people who claim they've flown the craft. And I had the first one come to me in 2013. I'd never heard about this before. I thought the woman was insane when she came. And in the book, I actually have over three dozen people who actually talk about the fact that they were allowed to fly the craft, and they all say basically the same thing. They put their hand on a panel, they put their hand on a ball, and the craft is alive, and they become one with the craft and whatever they think is what the craft does, and that you can move from one point in space to another point in space just by thinking about it within your head. And when you got 3 dozen witnesses, and this is 747 United Airlines pilot, U.S. Air Force retired colonel, John Ramirez from the CIA, Whitley Strieber, and all these people, and you start to realize there's something to this whole consciousness connection, which I think would interest in intelligence.
Yeah, so 23 years ago, I made my first visit to Skinwalker Ranch, and prior to that, I was a straightforward UFO, these must be ETs. That was the dominant paradigm at the time. I was changing a little bit because of Jacques Vallée's books and John Keel's books that there might be spillover with paranormal stuff. Skinwalker changed all that for me. You had a similar epiphany sort of at a UFO event. You're talking about UFOs, and suddenly it occurs to you, hey, there's a connection with apports, with this phenomena that most people just assume is related to spiritualism, mediums, ghost hunters, things of that sort, right?
Yeah, I had a sort of an awakening. It came with what they call with absolute certainty. It wasn't an idea. It was this is absolutely real. And then they played this game with my PowerPoint, and I remember going. They had doubled slides, tripled slides. The audio slides were missing. There was a slide sideways. The slides were expanded and pushed together, and it was like 50 slides out of 190 slides were just this mess. And I remember leaving the stage because I was testing to see the audio. And I remember Paula Harris was running the conference, and she said, "You coming for dinner?" I said, "No, I got a problem with my PowerPoint. Something's wrong with my PowerPoint." She said, "You know what they're doing?" I said, "No, that's not what they're doing." And I went back to the hotel room, and there was nothing wrong with the PowerPoint. And I reloaded it into the stick and went up, and the same thing again. And when that happens to you, your life changes. It's like, how did they do that? Almost like Charles Halt told me when he was in the United States, and a coin rolled across the floor, hit him in his boot. He looked down. It was a British pound coin.
Grant Cameron, you've done a lot of digging into presidential archives, looking for evidence that different presidents were interested in the UFO topic and how deeply that interest ran. I want to ask you about JFK, because the story is told in many circles that maybe that's why he was killed. He was pushing to explore or expose UFO secrets. Do you think there's anything to that?
That's the one president. I don't think there's anything to what's being said. It's the idea that he wanted to give this stuff away, but he didn't know anything. There's always this idea that the Democrats don't know, the Republicans do. He didn't know anything, but then he was going to try to give it away, and they bumped him up. Kennedy had piles and piles of people who didn't like him that would have knocked him out. I don't think there was anything. His brother was very interested. I put the material. Robert Kennedy was extremely interested in UFOs, but he's very skeptical. He answered all sorts of letters. There's a whole collection of letters at the Kennedy Library that deal with his brother talking about UFOs. And the other thing in the Kennedy administration was Arthur Lundahl, who was the first Weird Desk guy before Kit Green and Ron Pandolfi and those guys. He was in the administration there. He was very interested in UFOs and talked quite openly about UFOs with various people. But I don't follow any of the Kennedy's things. I think none of it makes sense to me. He was only in office for a couple of years. Didn't have any time to set up anything, and I don't think there was no interest. He didn't that I could see that he had interest in UFOs.
Yeah, there were a lot of people who wanted him gone for different reasons. He and his brother. You also tell the story in your Jimmy Carter book about Steven Spielberg, and Close Encounters came out in 1977. A lot of the debunkers, Phil Klass and like folks, were predicting, oh my gosh, this is going to cause a spike in UFO sighting reports. It didn't. But Spielberg tells a story, you cite it, that some in government wanted to block the release of his movie.
Yeah, the other one was that he was being given a bunch of money to put the movie out. The weird story was, to me, was when we went to the library. Of course, you do what are called alpha searches. So I can go and say, oh, okay, I want an alpha search done on George Knapp. And they'll say, okay, George Knapp never met with the president. He never phoned the president. Yeah, he never corresponded with the president. So there were all these different three things that they would say, your contact with the president. So I said, okay, I want the alpha file on Steven Spielberg. And he brings back the file, and he's all puzzled, this archivist. And he's going, I don't know what's going on here. And all there was in the file was a photocopy of a photograph that clearly looked like it was Rosalind Carter, Jimmy Carter, and Steven Spielberg. But what they had done is the letter to Steven Spielberg and the envelope were over top of Carter's face and Spielberg's face. And then I said, well, where's the photograph? And he looked, he could not find the photograph. And it was this weird thing that there was no evidence that he'd ever met with Steven Spielberg, and that here was this photocopied photograph. And the whole deal was that the story was, and I actually put it in from the Philadelphia Inquirer, that it was Carter at the end. He was having such a bad time. He was sitting there watching movies, and that his favorite movie was Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Huh. And so it came down to this whole idea about this secret connection between Spielberg, who had put this movie out, and the connection to the Holloman Air Force Base film. When I talked to Bob Emenegger when I was working on the Holloman Air Force Base film, I said, Bob, the weird thing about the Holloman Air Force Base film, the one that supposedly shown to the president, I said, if it weren't for the location and the time of day, it looks like it's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. He said, what, I didn't tell you? I said, no, you didn't tell me what? I didn't tell you I gave a copy of the documentary to Steven Spielberg? I said, no, you didn't tell me that. It was 1975. He gave him the thing. And he said, Annie Spielberg worked for me. I told you, she was a line producer for me. And Steven wanted a copy of the documentary, so I gave it to him. And 2 years later, the exact same scenario, 3 UFOs, 1 lands, the aliens come out, and it's all filmed and it's all planned and stuff like that. And basically took the thing, and Steven Spielberg's mother went to Bob Emenegger and said, Bob, I've seen your version of the landing, and I've seen Steven's version of the landing, and I like Steven's version better. So there's this bizarre connection between Steven Spielberg, who went to Reagan. We know he went to Reagan, and that's when Reagan made the famous statement when he showed E.T. the extraterrestrial. Reagan stands up, and we know there's 39 people in the room. I tracked down who was in the room, and he said, thank you for bringing E.T. the extraterrestrial to the White House, and I bet you there aren't 6 people in this whole room know how true this whole thing is. And so this Spielberg is an interesting character that was around the president.
Yeah, Reagan, like Carter, was one of the 2 presidents we know had a UFO sighting. I think he maybe had 2 of them. We're going to go to the phone, see what's on their minds of our callers, and we'll come back in a moment here. Wildcard Bill in L.A. Hey, Bill, how you doing?
Hey, happy Memorial Day, George.
And to you. What's on your mind?
Yeah, speaking of influential American nonagenarians, my lifelong hero since TV's Rawhide, U.S. Army veteran Clint Eastwood, turns 93 Wednesday.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, apropos of your show, his 1955 film debut was in a sci-fi thriller called Revenge of the Creature.
That's some good info there. Thanks.
I'll give you an interesting story. I did the book UFO Sky Pilots, which was one of the 3 books, and that was the whole idea that you use an interface. Like with the Wilson Leak document. The Wilson Leak document says we have a craft and we think it'll fly, which means they got a craft and they can't interface. There's no consciousness interface. They can't turn it on. And if you take a look at the Firefox, it was a movie done by Clint Eastwood back in the 1980s already. Yeah. The thing about the interface with stealing the Russian MiG-31 or whatever it was, that's the whole story that the UFO people are telling about flying the craft. You have this interface with the machine, and the machine is alive, and you're flying the thing with your mind, which is where you can see the technology going.
Yeah, Grant, I have a question about President Truman. As far as I can tell, Harry Truman remains the only sitting president ever to confirm to the public via the news media that the Pentagon Joint Chiefs were routinely discussing what Truman called flying saucers in a 1950 Kinescope TV news interview. And it seems like that is the last time a president has actually made an honest statement about UAPs, an actual sitting president. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, there's that one. Eisenhower was asked, and he sort of walked around. He said, "I've got a friend in the Air Force," and he says, "There's nothing to it." But then there was this break, almost till Clinton came. There was a break where that's what I mentioned at the beginning. The word UFO was not used in the Eisenhower administration, the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration,
Nixon.
All the administrations up to Bill Clinton was the first one to start talking about UFOs. Until then, it was like a dirty word. You just did not use it. The president never used the word. So yeah, that was a very interesting thing where he basically says, "Yeah, we discussed it every time we met with the military." That's what the reference you're making is on camera. He says, "Yeah," and so the idea is, the president doesn't know. And every time you look, you see, "Oh yeah, the president did know." He just wasn't very open about it.
Thanks for the call, Bill. Appreciate it. We're going to Linda in Spokane, Washington, on West of the Rockies line. Hi, Linda. You're on with Grant Cameron.
Well, my question is, humankind has the ability to fight this with the help of the good Pleiadians or Nordics.
Okay. All right. Thanks for the call, Linda. It doesn't sound like you have a question. I appreciate you sharing that with us. Grant, do you have any thoughts on aliens walking among us?
Well, this is a question I think more and more you see. I mean, is this aliens? I mean, it's starting to look like we're all going to become Jacques Vallée types. It's the alien thing is sort of fading away, and you get this idea where it can change to whatever it wants. It can take on whatever form it wants. The story where your friend Colm Kelleher talks about, where these 6 people on Skinwalker Ranch, and they've all got these night vision binoculars, and this thing comes over the ridge, and they're all watching it with the night vision binoculars, and at the end of the night they all compare notes, and everybody saw something different. This whole idea it comes down to this thing about what is reality and what are we actually seeing and what are we dealing with. I think it's going to be, they can appear as whatever they want. They've been around for thousands of years. And in 1896, they were appearing as guys from Mars and looked like, with beards and stuff like that. And you can see it shifted, almost like Skinwalker Ranch. It was never the same thing twice. It just keeps shifting. It moves along. It does this. There's been no ground traces for 25 years. I think this is a phenomena that is gradually exposing itself, and the way it does it is through the support thing, where you have, how does science advance? It advances through curiosity. So they take a woman, she puts the groceries in, they put the groceries back in the bag, and then they put the bulls in the trailer, and they do all this weird stuff, and then George Knapp sees it, and he says, hey, we should do a book about this, and George Knapp writes a book, and then the people in the DIA people in the Middle East say, hey, this is kind of weird, let's go and check this out, and then this Lakatsky goes to Skinwalker Ranch, and this thing is floating in the kitchen, almost saying to him, "Welcome, Dr. Lakatsky. We wondered why if you'd ever show up." And then they do this display, and then you get this disclosure because people are curious. And they push this issue forward. The same as Jim Semivan. Jim Semivan complains about his abduction. Oh, he was abducted. It was terrible, whatever. I'll tell you what, Jim Semivan is the guy behind the disclosure. He's the guy that went to all the three-letter agencies and said, you guys can't get this thing out. We're going to drop this thing. We're going to move this thing. We're not going to use classified material. If he had not been abducted, if he had not had the experience, there would have been no disclosure. Same as Nimitz. Why did they drop from 80,000 feet down to sea level in the Nimitz? They want everybody to go, wow, this is pretty weird. Like, what's going on here? And the curiosity goes, and that's how you advance science. And that's what they're doing. Slowly they're moving things. They're keeping people curious, as opposed to 1874 when Max Planck's advisor, before he won the Nobel Prize, said, no use going into physics. We got it all figured out.
Right.
And that's what we've got to do. Is it keeps us curious, and you can see this disclosure thing taking place by all these weird things they're doing, and we're moving into this disclosure thing where people are trying to figure out what's going on, and as we move along, we discover things, and we discover the stuff we believed before was wrong.
Yeah, it seems like the phenomena itself, the intelligence, is putting on a show, a display, a performance, as Bob Bigelow calls it. What happened to Jim Lakatsky at Skinwalker had a profound effect. He went back to D.C., talked to Harry Reid. They cooked up a program that became known as OSAP. That led to ATIP. That led to the UAP Task Force and to Arrow. I mean, it's dominoes falling in a sequence of events.
Yeah, that goes back to my first question that I had in 1975 is what's this thing doing? Why was it in Carmen, Manitoba? And it's this thing, like, why would you drop from 80,000 feet down to sea level in 7/8 of a second? That makes no sense. Why does a UFO fly away like a bullet when say, at Skinwalker Ranch, where they have the 2016 sighting, what's it doing? I mean, it doesn't make any sense except to make you wonder what's really going on, to start questioning reality. And it's doing this over and over and over again, and it's working. It's the way they're doing disclosure, and the government's doing the same thing. They're sort of putting part of it out, but they're not putting the whole thing out. And I think they've learned from whatever this intelligence is that you just moves people along. Science advances one funeral at a time, and the old ideas, people die, and the new generation is not offended with the idea. You go to kids now compared to when you and I started, and you say, do you think there's UFOs? Well, of course there's UFOs. Do you think there's portals? Well, of course there's portals. I mean, it's a completely different world, and it's this gradual acclimatization that's being done by the phenomena to move us to the point where 100 years from now, kids will think you're absolutely insane if you didn't believe all this stuff. And it's just moving it one step at a time, rather than going in and doing the left brain thing and saying, landing and saying, we're here to bring you freedom, democracy, Jesus, McDonald's, and next thing you know, people are pointing guns and telling you to get lost because you're walking in. They're doing this indirect thing where they're forcing us to figure it out.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you make the point. Uri Geller, for example, shows up, I think, in both of the two books that we're talking about that you wrote and published. He was a key to UFO knowledge and investigations, but he also shows up in remote viewing and the reports that show up from him. The story that you tell in your book about he with Edgar Mitchell at Stanford Research Institute, what pops up as they're having a bite. Go ahead and tell that. We've got about 3 minutes left. Yeah,
so he has the story that's told. That's when I went to Hal Puthoff, and he said, Hal, you know this metal people are recovering these pieces of metal, like little. They're always like the size of your thumb or whatever. And I said, this has got to be a port. You had this in the lab. And that's when he said, well, we'll investigate one piece at a time. It doesn't make any sense. Like, why would the thing fly across the galaxy to visit us, and then little pieces start falling off? It doesn't make any sense. It makes more sense what happened in the lab was they had Uri Geller in there, and they went for lunch, and there was Edgar Mitchell and Hal Puthoff and Uri Geller, and then Uri Geller bites down on this thing that cuts his lip, and he pulls it out, and Edgar Mitchell said, where'd you get that from? That's my flight pin. I lost that 2 years ago in Houston. And he takes the pin, and then they go back to the lab, and in the lab, they're standing there, and Uri Geller's in another room, so they can't accuse Uri Geller of this, and suddenly they hear behind Hal Puthoff another piece falls, and it's the back half of the pin, and then another piece falls, and so I said to Hal, come on, this is what's going on. It's this Apport thing. They're doing this weird stuff, so the metal stuff to me is clearly it's got to be Apport material. They're dropping this stuff on purpose, or even the sample where they get from the Ubatuba thing, where part of the sample has all the isotopes are okay, and the other part, all the isotopes are all messed up, and it's like, hey, figure this out. It's just this weird stuff where they've got Nolan running, and everybody's trying to figure it out, and it's that curiosity that once you get down the rabbit hole, you can't get out. I mean, you're just obsessed with this stuff, and that's what they want. That's how they're moving this thing down the road.
You tell the story about Jim Lukatsky having his this thing appeared in the sky when he visited Skinwalker Ranch, and then later on down the road, these intelligence guys show up at the ranch and things follow them home, hitchhikers, which you sort of equate. There's again spillover effect from one phenomena to the next, all as part of an acclimation process.
Yeah, that's what you see when you start looking at all the phenomena. Is there's all these crossovers between death and out-of-body experiences and all this kind of stuff. People seeing in 360 degrees, and that's when you start to realize like maybe we should be looking at this whole phenomena as one thing and listen to the experiencers, because the experiencers are dealing with the intelligence. We're now in this thing in Washington where we're going to go back to sightings again. They've sort of done a bait and switch where we're going to do sightings, and 95% of sightings are explainable, and the other 5% we have enough information we could explain it, and I think we've got to go to the experiencer. And that's where the research done at Skinwalker Ranch was so important, because it goes to this other aspect of not just lights in the sky, because there really wasn't that many UFOs back in the 1990s there. It was all this other weird stuff that led people to understand that the world is not the way, and the Russians were working on it, and the Chinese were working on it to help put off. They knew the Chinese kids were doing this stuff, apporting stuff and making stuff appear and disappear, and it's this game that this stuff is real, and it's all connected. Even the hitchhiker thing is called it's an attachment in the ghost
literature, right? And Grant Cameron. Grant, is always great to talk to you. We pack a lot into the time when you're on the program. I hope people will check out Jimmy Carter, Paranormal and UFO Tales. And also, what's the title of your Apport book?
The Apport book is Apports and Manifestations.
Okay, yeah, they're both
UFO Sky Pilots.
Yeah, they're all the two I've read. I haven't read the third, but I will get into it, and it's great work. It's always great to talk to you. Thanks for being here.
The Coast mobile app is now available for download on iPhones and Android devices. You can become an insider directly through this app. This is a great option for our international listeners, and new users will also receive a free 2-week trial.